actually an accident and not an act of intentional terror. And by that point, I was relieved, and my anger at the mayor started to go up. And I'm still holding on to it because I'm that kind of guy.
What happened with us was Carrie Nation, who's in my Havara. A couple of them came over to my house because
I can't get on
here, and she said her daughter told her that it was an accident. I found up on the police station.
Hang on one second, Judy. You're with us, Judy. If you're trying to get on, we can hear you and see you.
Yeah, I can't see anything. I'll have to go out and come back in.
Go ahead. I can see you. You're wearing a nice red plaid shirt.
Yeah, I know what I'm wearing, but it's the whole screen is black, and I can only see your little box here, Rabbi. I don't have the grid.
Hang on a second. Maybe this. How about that?
Yeah, there. Yeah, that worked because I couldn't see it either.
Oh,
now
that's even better. That's even better. I had the slides ready. I was trying to get the slides going and talking to people, get the recording on. It's 12 o'clock. It's time for some learning. Hi, everybody. Philip, I'm sorry to have cut you off before, but I realized that we were doing somewhere. Okay. I don't even know what country you're in these days.
I'm somewhere between the Czech Republic on my way back to Austria.
Sehr gut. Sehr gut. So we are coming from all over the country. It is great to be with everybody on this day. For those of you who have been at Temple for more than a week and a half, you know that you are in for a treat, because whenever Robin Eisenberg teaches, we're going to have some fun. We're going to have some enjoyment, and I've been looking forward to this opportunity to teach with Robin on this topic since we put it together a few months ago. And Robin, I'm basically going to give it over to you. I got the slides up and ready to go. So we're going to be talking today about Reform Jewish history vis-a-vis the LGBTQ community, because there's a lot to talk about. And we're going to share a little bit of sort of documentary history of the community, but also, Robin and I each have our own experiences in working in the reform movement through these time periods. Robin more so than I do, and that's going to be part of the conversation as well. So, Robin, take it away.
So, thanks, Greg. So when Greg and I were talking about how to frame this session, it became very clear to both of us that we both had stories about being in the reform movement, and especially at this time when the reform movement was really a leader in the gay and lesbian movements. So I thought that I would share a little bit about my own story. I know that Greg knows some of this, Jeff Katz knows some of this, but that I would share a little bit about me growing up in the reform movement and being married and then coming out as a lesbian. So I grew up in the reform movement. I became an educator at a reform congregation in 1973 when I graduated from college. And I was doing the path of every good Jewish girl. I was dating boys. I was thinking about that I was going to get married. And the summer that I was starting my new job as an educator, I had my first lesbian relationship. And I sort of played back and forth between being a lesbian and being straight for a number of years. And then I ended up getting married, had 2 children, and came to Temple Bethel in 1980. I was living a life of, being a Jewish professional and having my children growing up. And in 1987, I met someone. My children at that point were 2 and 5. And I met someone, and it stirred all of those lesbian feelings that I had back 10 years before. And I ended up getting divorced and basically have lived a life with my partner, Andy, ever since then. So I was in a community and I was in a profession that being lesbian or gay was very accepted. I was at the URJ biennial convention in San Francisco when the first resolution was passed about being accepting of gay and lesbians. I am part of a group of Jewish educators, rabbis, cantors, who have been very visible about being out and being accepted. Rabbi Singer, our Rabbi Emeritus, performed a commitment ceremony for me and Andy in 2001. So Temple Beth El has a history of being very accepting and welcoming and inclusionary. We've had over the years teachers who were gay and lesbian, and there has never been, to my knowledge, any problems with that kind of thing. So I'm very proud that Temple Beth El has taken this next step under Greg's leadership to not just say that being welcoming is enough, but really to take the next step and celebrating and being inclusionary. So that's sort of my story.
Thank you, Robin. What I want to do is share mine, which is much briefer and less interesting. But one of the reasons why that Robin and I wanted to share our personal stories is to also invite you to think about your own, because we're going to look at today at some of the positions and resolutions and things that our movement and the various branches of the movement have advocated for. And I want to invite people to think about, as we look at them, not only what they say, but also what they don't say, right? We are living in 2021. We are living in a world where there is marriage equality for our entire country, where there are certain legal protections that didn't exist even a generation ago, and some that we're still fighting for. But that hasn't always been the case. And part of what today's going to be is for us to think about our own lives and our own experiences and what went on in our movements and around the world at the same time. So it's funny, Robin and I, when we met last week, she had said she had just finished a training session with the board of a synagogue in Chicago in the suburbs, which is the one that I had grown up at in Northfield, Illinois. But in my life, and I'll be very frank, there was no one in my family who is out as anything but straight and cisgendered. And which doesn't mean that there's no one in my family who is LGBTQ, so no one's out about it. So there's no one that I grew up with in a part of my own family around this. And so this isn't something that I didn't come to this and my sense of advocacy out of a personal experience until I got to rabbinical school. And when I got to rabbinical school, there were certainly classmates of mine in my class and in the college who were openly gay. Not that it was my first experience, but it was the first time I was working closely with folks. And then in my last 2 years in rabbinical school, I got what I considered to be the creme de la creme placement as a student rabbi, to be placed with Rabbi Denise Eger, who is the rabbi of Congregation Kol Ami in West Hollywood. Denise is openly gay, and she was the first woman to be the president of the LA County Board of Rabbis, and the first openly gay person to be the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform Movement's rabbinical arm. So Denise is a leader in the movement on so many different ways. I mean, she's a leader because you're a leader, right? When you're a leader, and anywhere you go, people will follow you. and that's who she is. And she's also a pioneer in the sense that she has used her leadership and I don't want to say used her sexuality, but she has recognized that who she is as a person and who she is as a leader are inextricably linked. And so she has used her leadership throughout her career to do what at times has been very, very hard work of expanding the movement to be more welcoming and accepting. And she will tell you that when she was in rabbinical school, and as an undergrad, she went to USC for her undergrad work, and there were, because the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles is geographically adjacent to USC, there's always been a relationship between the college and the university, both at the undergraduate level and in the graduate level. She will share with you that when she was in rabbinical school, it was not always so easy for her to be open to she wasn't out to everybody because of her experience there. But this was a generation and a half ago. And she's become a leader. She was at one synagogue, and then she founded Kol Ami in the early 2000s. And I got to work with her. I got to work with a woman who was going to be the next president of the CCAR. And Kol Ami, for those of you who don't know, which I'm guessing is most of you, because why would you? Kol Ami is a neighborhood synagogue for West Hollywood. What does that mean? It's a Reform community that reflects the makeup of West Hollywood. West Hollywood is, and we were joking when we were this weekend, very similar to Wilson Manors in a lot of different ways. It's a community, it's a wonderful community, there's a lot of folks around, and it has a strong LGBTQ population that's a part of it, but it's not the only thing that's there. And it's not all about that all the time, although it's a very warm and welcoming place. So the makeup of Kol Ami when I was there was about 3/4 gays and lesbian, and then about 1/4 was not. And so she was a rabbi to everybody. She can be a rabbi to a straight couple as a lesbian in the same way that a straight man can hopefully be a rabbi to a gay couple or gay individual. That it's something to talk about, but not be the only thing that's a part of the conversation. But my time there as a cisgendered straight guy, recently married, became a father when I was there. It was an eye-opening experience for me in terms of working closely with gay individuals and the things, to give one example, it took me about 8 months of working there to realize how many members of the synagogue are HIV positive. It wasn't talked about very much. Denise and the synagogue had been on the forefront of support for the HIV positive community from the 80s on forward. But it didn't even occur to me that, wow, there's all these guys who are here who are HIV positive and who've been living healthy lives all these years after that. And that's a whole other conversation that we're not going to spend too much time focusing on. But, like we've talked about in other contexts, like you don't really know a community till you get inside of it. And you don't know what are some of the issues or experiences of individuals who are gay and lesbian till you're part of it. And so my 2 years at Kol Ami was in many ways eye-opening. And it situated me to, I think, get to where we are at Bethel now, which is that our movement in a lot of ways talks the talk, and we'll see some of the talk from the statements that we have, and to a similar but lesser degree, walk the walk. And the place that I think we are, which is that there are certain pockets of our community where they talk the talk and walk the walk. There are some pockets where they're not even talking the talk. And a lot of the movement says, yes, we are warm and welcoming, we are opening, but doing the work to actually be that is the conversation I think that we're in as a community right now, which I'm loving having this conversation. And so, if I hadn't been placed as Denise's intern for 2011, 2013, I'm not sure we'd be doing this right now in the community. I don't know. I hope we would have been. I hope it would have come up otherwise. But I can say for myself, like I just would not be in this place personally if it wasn't for the experiences that I had, and I treasure that experience because I think I think it's made me a better rabbi, and I'm hoping to make our community better as a result. So, a couple of things that we want to share to kick things off, and we are using some resources that were published in Mishkan Ga'ava, Where Pride Dwells, a celebration of LGBTQ Jewish life and ritual, a book that was published a year and a half ago by the Central Council of American Rabbis, which of course Denise was the editor, and I was privileged to offer a few pieces to be published in. Nothing that I published we're looking at today, this is a different piece of it. But this is sort of the beginning of the conversation in the reform movements. And these are dates that, frankly, when I saw them, I was surprised. I was surprised to learn that as far back in 1965, Women of Reform Judaism, the WRJ, passed a resolution calling for the decriminalization of homosexuality. Why? Why did they pass the resolution for decriminalization? Because it was a criminal act in a lot of communities. Homosexuality was a crime in 1965. This is before Stonewall, and the movement was already out ahead of that conversation. In 1977, what was then called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now known as the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, passed the first resolution calling for human rights for homosexuals.
So let me talk a little bit about that one. That biennial was in San Francisco, and there was, at that point, I had already connected with a number of Reform Jewish professionals who were lesbian and gay. And there was a fear that there was going to be some opposition to this resolution. It was an unrealized fear. There was no reason to have that fear, but there were these meetings at 11 o'clock at night before the resolution came before the plenum to say, what will we do if there's opposition? P.S. There was not any opposition. There was a great deal of support, but as early as that, the Jewish professionals who are lesbian and gays started to, organize themselves, so to speak.
And since then, there has been, the movement has called for a variety of public policy positions. And one thing I want to pull apart are when the union or the institutions of the union set policy for itself, which is one thing that they can do, and the other is when they advocacy for larger public policy positions, right? So, for example, looking at the slide, for example, the movements cannot make civil marriage or same-sex marriage legal in the country. It can't do that. It can advocate for that, and it has many, many times. At the same time, the union can say things like same-sex couples should be treated like opposite-sex couples in terms of membership in the movement. Or the Central Conference of American Rabbis should say that rabbis should feel empowered to marry same-sex couples just like they do opposite-sex couples without any concern. And other rabbinical associations, other movements have taken different positions on those same questions along the way. But when we look at this particular slide, the piece at the bottom of including gays and lesbians in the rabbin and the cantorate, that's a thing that we can do on our own. Civil marriage, we can recognize it, we can practice it, we can't make it happen. That's the thing that the civil authorities have to do. Passing resolutions calling on the elimination of discrimination in places like the armed forces and the Boy Scouts, again, things that the movement was able to advocate for, but couldn't make happen. Support for workplace non-discrimination and civil rights legislation, again, legislation we can't do, but we can say this is how we're going to behave as institutions. The reality is, Robin, you mentioned that Bethel's own history. I'm sure there are other communities who don't have the same history, other congregations who don't have the same history
Right.
of how they treated gay and lesbian members of their staff and other queer folk along the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are some horror stories about, what happened when people were discovered, when people were outed. We're very fortunate to all be associated with Temple Bethel.
a lot has changed in the last 60 years or so, right? At the time when the WRJ, Women Reform Judaism, was calling upon the country to decriminalize homosexuality, was the time of the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery. It was when the St. Louis Arch was completed, and Dr. Zhivago premiered. That was a long time ago that this was going on. Some other examples, looking at this slide, in the 70s, you've got Roe versus Wade. You've got Dark Side of the Moon coming out and The Godfather. Other things in 1977, when that same year that Robin was talking about the big resolution at the UAHC, was also for the first time that there was a right-wing government that went into power in Israel. The Likud took over for the first time. A lot has certainly gone on in our country, and a lot of scholarship has gone into the idea that there really has been, from 1965 until about the 2000s, not much happened, and then things happened very, very quickly, especially from a civil side. We had institutions like ours doing things that we could do. Robin, I'm not going to ask how many times you and Andy have gotten married. But that's the story you hear from a lot of same-sex couples, as they've gotten married several different times and several different occasions for several different reasons, as there has been so much change. And now we're in a place where, those going forward, couples don't need to go through all the different hoops that couples had to go through in the past.
So you might have seen on that previous slide that the state of Vermont was the first state to legalize same-sex unions, and some of we have a house in Vermont, and that was our impetus when we went to Rabbi Singer in 2001 and asked for him to perform our ceremony. We knew we couldn't get married in the state of Florida, but one of our requests was that, we could go get married in Vermont. And, but he was very willing to have a ceremony. It just couldn't be a civil ceremony. So.
Well, Robin, do you mind sharing, you got married in Vermont. Were you legally married in Vermont?
No, we weren't legally married in Vermont. We just used that as a jumping off point to be able to say we wanted to get married.
I see. Okay. So we're looking now at a couple of the statements, and Robin and I have pulled what we thought were the highlights of this, and to put into our minds what was the movement thinking at the time. So this is 1989. Rachel, that was before you were born, but I think the rest of us were around in 1989. And an interesting, and the resolutions tend to have a series of statements to sort of contextualize what they're going to be advocating for, and then what they're advocating for. So this is in North America then, 1989. There were about 100,000 Reform Jews and about 50,000 members of the larger Jewish community who they estimated were gay or lesbian in 1989. In 1977, the UAHC had passed that resolution calling upon the end of discrimination. That's the one that Robin had alluded to earlier. And in 1987 had called upon the synagogues to include gays and lesbians in all parts of synagogue life. And then this is where the language gets, beautiful. Our union of congregations must be a place where loneliness and suffering and exile end, where gay and lesbian Jews can know that they are accepted in terms of visibility, not invisibility, that we place no limits on their communal or spiritual aspirations. That clearly was a typo. No limits to their communal or spiritual aspirations. Therefore, the UAHC resolves to reaffirm its 87 resolution and call upon all departments of the union and the congregations to fully implement its provisions, to embark upon a movement-wide program of heightened awareness and education to achieve the fuller acceptance of gays and lesbian Jews in our midst, to urge our member congregations to welcome gay and lesbian Jews to membership as singles, couples, and families, and commend the CCAR for its sensitive and thorough efforts to raise the consciousness of the rabbinates regarding homosexuality. We urge the CCAR to pursue its own mandate with vigor and complete its tasks as soon as possible in order to respond to the communal and spiritual aspirations of gay and lesbian Jews. So what's in that statement and what's not in that statement?
It's not federal law.
So right, this is not about law. This isn't what goes on, what you can and can't do. This isn't about marital benefits and Social Security or survivor benefits if you're in the military. It's about what member synagogues of the UAHC can do. Yeah, you're right, Judy.
Trans is missing, but I don't know that the awareness anywhere in the country was there at that time.
For sure, right? I think Jeff, you cut out at the beginning of Jeff, so I'll repeat what you said because I didn't hear. But the idea that trans folk are not included explicitly in this policy statement in ways that they certainly are included today. For sure, for sure. I was really intrigued by number 2, embark upon a movement-wide program of heightened awareness and education. Because I think that's the work that we're still doing in a lot of ways, right? It's one thing to say in your bylaws, we welcome all couples regardless of the gender of their sexual orientation. But creating a place of safety isn't the same thing. I'm going to use the state of Florida as an example. It is legal anywhere in the state of Florida for a same-sex couple to get a marriage license. But I would imagine that going to get that license in Broward County in Fort Lauderdale feels different than going to get it in Polk County, wherever Polk County happens to be. I just know that it's a county that I don't know where it is, right? And so it'd be one thing for the synagogue to say we welcome everybody, but if you're not doing anything in the congregation to be warm and welcoming, to help, and I want to be honest and say, to help people unlearn the presumptions that they had, right? If we're going back to this, if this is 89, we're not that far removed from Stonewall. We're not that far removed from the resolution on decriminalization from 65. There are folks who are sitting on the boards of the congregations in 1989 who grew up thinking that homosexuality was so immoral it should be criminalized. That was the world that they were living in at the time.
So you also have that this is very different regionally. So having been very active, I was the president of the National Association of Temple Educators, which is now ARJE, which is the Reform Educator Group. I was president in 1991. And therefore, I sat on the URJ board during my term as the NATE president. And there were conversations about congregations, particularly in the South, particularly in isolated areas, that, you know, we're talking about the URJ or, you know, was not the movement for them because policies like the resolutions like this could not become policies of their congregation. They could not live with it because of their secular communities, because of attitudes and things like that. So it was definitely an interesting time.
And Robin, that observation is really powerful. And it also reminds me that this is still going on. This exact, where we were in 1989 as a movement is where other faith communities are currently. And the example I'm thinking of over and over again is the Methodist Church. Right, for those of you who are not as familiar with this, the United Methodist Church, which is one of the largest churches in the world. It certainly has a big presence in Boca Raton. First Methodist is the church. It's right behind Meisner Park. And their west building is the one at Lions and Glades that has the pumpkin patch every year. And I've become very, very friendly with their pastors. the church is going through a fracture right now on multiple fronts, because there have been a series of votes at both the international level, but also at the church level around these same policy positions about being open and welcoming to same-sex couples and to non-hetero folk, and also the question of clergy and whether they can ordain gay and lesbian clergy. And I know that not only is the church going to break at the international level, I should say no, but I have a sense it's going to break at the international level because you've got that regional biases around the world, but also in the U.S. you've got churches, and from what I heard from my colleagues locally, it was not like an overwhelmingly vote one way or the other in the local church here what they wanted to do about this, which really speaks, I think, to some of the tension, which you've got some folks who think this is everything we should be doing, and we should be doing all this and then some, and other folks who are saying we want no part of this. This is not what our tradition teaches. And when you've got those two groups of people sharing a church and sharing a building and sharing a congregation, that is a recipe for a lot of angst and a lot of difficulty. What I heard Robin say was more that you had the regional differences where you got congregations in some areas were all for this, congregations and others were all against it. But I don't know, Robin, you would know better than I would. Did you hear tell of places where the congregations were split within the congregation?
Certainly there were. The ones that came the loudest were particularly some in isolated areas and in the South, where because of the type of community that they were in, like one of the places I distinctly remember is Mobile, Alabama. At that point, the URJ or the UAAC, I guess at that point, had regional biennials, and there was a regional biennial scheduled in Mobile sometime in this, late 80s, early 90s. And the movement decided not to go to Mobile because there was such tension over these recommendations.
Interesting. Well, if we fast forward 7 years, this is a different arm of the movement now. This is the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So the URJ, the UAHC, is really the network of synagogues, right? The synagogues are members of the union. The CCAR is the rabbinic group that Rabbi Dan, Rabbi Jessica, and I are all members of. It's our professional group. And this is in 1996. 1996, by the way, was right around the time of the conversations around Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the armed services. The Defense of Marriage Act was also a major piece of federal legislation around this time. So what's interesting is what we're seeing and Judy mentioned before, the federal law was moving in one direction in the 90s under the Clinton administration, where our movement was moving in the opposite direction. And I think, just for 1 second, if I can editorialize, what I think we saw going on in the federal side was President Clinton didn't want to alienate anybody, so he just sort of let it kind of Don't Ask, Don't Tell is a good example of that, which is trying not to bother anybody, ends up bothering everybody. That's a whole other conversation. Consistent with our Jewish commitments to the fundamental principle that we are all created in the divine image, the Reform movement has, quote, been the vanguard of the support for the full recognition of equality for lesbians and gays in society. In 1977, the CCAR adopted a resolution encouraging legislation which decriminalizes homosexual acts between consenting adults and prohibits discrimination against them as persons, followed by its adoption in 1990 of a substantial position paper on homosexuality and the rabbinates. In 93, the UAHC observed that committed lesbian and gay couples are derived of benefits routinely accorded for married and heterosexual couples. The UAHC resolved that full equality under the law for lesbian and gay people requires legal recognition of lesbian and gay relationships. In light of this background, be it resolved that the CCAR support the right of gay and lesbian couples to share fully and equally in the rights of civil marriage, and be it further resolved that the CCAR oppose governmental efforts to ban gay and lesbian marriage, and be it further resolved as a matter of civil law, it is separate from the question of rabbinic officiation at such marriages. Huh. So, Robin, can you explain the last piece to me? Because I can't.
Yeah, there's not much to explain. I think that this is the tension between the civil law and the what Reform Judaism has to say.
Well, there's something else I think going on here as well. What I was thinking about, which is that this resolution doesn't require Reform rabbis to perform civil marriages of gays and lesbians. And a little bit of inside information for the group about the way the rabbinic organizations work. Other movements will take disciplinary action against the members of their rabbinates based on certain things that they do religiously, right? So, for example, as a conservative rabbi, if you marry someone who is Jewish to someone who is not, you will lose your membership in the rabbinic organization, the rabbinical assembly. And I'm sure the same is true for the Orthodox Union, which is the main non-Orthodox rabbinic organization. And the same was true in the 90s for conservative rabbis and into the 2000s even around same-sex marriage, right? If you performed a same-sex marriage as a conservative rabbi, you would be subject to sanction, including expulsion. The CCR does not do that. That's not what you have to do to get kicked out of the CCR. You got to do other things, mostly around stealing money or having inappropriate relationships. That's basically what it would take to get kicked out of the CCR, and that's about it. You can have a bacon cheeseburger on Yom Kippur and remain a Reform rabbi if that's how you think the Holy One calls upon you to do things. But what's interesting, and I say that in jest, but this last piece of this resolution, to me, takes a lot of the teeth out of it.
Right.
Because if you're resolving as an organization, this is what we stand for, and then you say, but you don't have to. I would have voted differently in 1996, but in 1996, I wasn't a rabbi, I was a bar mitzvah. So I didn't have the same authority as I do now to be in the conversation.
But I think that what it does is it shows how far we have come. When you think about this kind of thing, the fact that Denise Egger was the president of the CCAR, I don't think in 1996 anybody would have envisioned a lesbian being the president of the CCAR.
Was this resolution passed? Was all this passed?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, these are adopted resolutions. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Rob, I'll also make a comment about gender relationships, which is, I think it's surprising to me to know that the first non-hetero head of the CCAR was a woman and not a man, just because of the gender imbalance in the Reform rabbinates. There's plenty.
Right.
There's plenty of gay men who are rabbis. There are plenty of lesbians who are rabbis. That Denise was of the LGBTQ group. That she went first, I think, speaks to something else, mostly about her.
Right.
In that way. But yeah, in 1996, it was she was installed as president in 2015. So 19 years later. Just 4 years later, from 96 to 2000, the CCR takes on another resolution about officiation, right? Here they said, we're not going to take it. This is separate from the question of officiation. 4 years later, which means, barely a sneeze in some ways, they're back at it. The CCAR Committee on Responsa addressed the question of whether homosexual marriage can qualify as kiddushin, which it defines as Jewish marriage. By a committee majority of 7-2, the committee concluded that homosexual relationships, however exclusive and committed they may be, do not fit within this legal category. They cannot be called kiddushin. We do not understand Jewish marriage apart from the concept of kiddushin. The committee acknowledged its lack of consensus on this question. Now, this is a little complicated. Kiddushin is in a word means holiness. And there is a notion within Judaism that the married relationship is on its own spiritual plane, on its own plane of sanctification, on its own plane of holiness. It's what separates, and taking gender and sexual orientation out of the equation for a second, it's what separates the dating couple from the married couple, or the engaged couple from the married couple. That when you make the vows you make under the chuppah, you enter into this kiddushin. And it certainly carries with it the history of how the tradition has understood marriage. And for several thousand years, that has meant a man and a woman together. And so only 21 years ago, the responsive committee, which is kind of as close to a sort of legal committee or legal advisory committee that the reform movement has, was asked the question, do same-sex couples qualify for that most favored nation status of Kiddushin? And their answer at the time was a resounding but not unanimous no. 7-2 no. I will say in the outset I disagree with that, and you'll see where this conversation goes, but that's where they were in the late 90s. The Ad Hoc Committee on Human Sexuality issued a report in 1998, which included in its conclusion, by committee majority of 11 with one abstention, that Kiddushin may be present in a committed same-gender relationship between two Jews, and that these relationships can serve as the foundation of stable Jewish families, thus adding strength to the Jewish community. The report calls upon the CCAR to support all colleagues in their choices in this matter and develop educational programs. So you've got two committees of the CCAR made up of, I don't know the membership, but I'm guessing different groups of Reform rabbis who come to different conclusions around this question. I will say that the responsive committee tends to be a little more traditionally oriented. They tend to be more scholarly, and it tends to be a little less progressive. And if there is an ad hoc committee on human sexuality that is formed, who are the folks who are going to be part of that committee? The people who spend their time thinking about what's going on around human sexuality and how might we want to think about it for the new age. That group is going to tend to be a little more progressive. Just on one foot, the way to think about it. And here's the resolution. Whereas justice and human dignity are cherished Jewish values, and whereas in March of 1999, the Women's Rabbinic Network passed a resolution urging the CCAR to bring the issue of honoring ceremonies between two Jews of the same gender to the floor of the convention plenum, and whereas the institutions of the Reform Judaism have a long history of support for civil and equal rights for gays and lesbians, and whereas North American organizations of the Reform movement have passed resolutions in support of civil marriage for gays and lesbians, therefore we do hereby resolve that the relationship of a Jewish same-gender couple is worthy of affirmation through appropriate Jewish ritual, and further resolved, we recognize the diversity of opinions within our ranks on this issue. We support the decision of those who choose to officiate at rituals of the union for same-gender couples, and we support the decision of those who do not. And further resolved, we call upon the CCR to support all colleagues in their choice in this matter, and further resolve that we also call upon the CCR to develop educational and liturgical resources in this area. Jeff.
Is Kiddushin something that would usually be addressed in a resolution, as it seems that they left it out here?
So I think they didn't. I think that they didn't leave it out. I think they didn't say it, and they said what they feel. Because where this plays out is that essentially every rabbi gets to make the decision for themselves, and part of that plays out in the blessing for Kiddushin that is offered at a wedding. So in the liturgy for a wedding, there are a series of blessings. And one of them is a blessing that uses the word Kiddushin. And you may, this may feel like it's hair splitting. but it's important hair splitting, which is some rabbis at this time and even today will offer that kiddushin blessing, the standard traditional blessing that they would give to any hetero couple. They would use the same blessing for a same-sex couple, and some rabbis would not. And whether or not the rabbi chooses to use the kiddushin blessing answers that question. But in the statement in the top of these three resolutions, that the rabbi can do what they want, kind of says the rabbi can do what they want. It's an interesting question to think about, which is to whom is kiddushin answerable? Is it kiddushin when the couple feels empowered to see themselves in that way? Is it kiddushin when the rabbi deigns to give them that blessing? Or is it kiddushin when you stand before the Holy One? My answer is it's the Holy One, first and foremost. The couple second, and frankly, me third. But I consider myself on the more progressive end of this conversation. I'll give another mode of context, which is the question around the kiddushin blessing is also a question that remains unanswered vis-a-vis interfaith couples. There are some rabbis who invoke the kiddushin blessing for interfaith couples and other of the same blessings, and others who will not. And personally, I don't have a good answer yet because I do it, but I'm not sure I like it. But I'm not sure I don't like it either. I'm still figuring it out for myself in a variety of different places around the liturgy, around weddings. I'm a rabbi who performs interfaith marriages regularly with certain circumstances, mostly about the idea of creating a Jewish home. And for me, that's kind of where I end up, which is if this couple is wanting to create a Jewish home, then I am inclined to say that's an act of kiddushin. If they're not, then they're not. But I'm just one of 3,000 members of the CCAR who is empowered by this resolution to make a decision of and for myself.
And it hasn't changed since this resolution?
The language around it has changed.
I'm talking about globally.
So the language around marriage has not changed. By the way, the language around conversion in our movement hasn't changed since the 1920s. In the 1920s, the responsive committee passed a resolution saying basically of the traditional elements required for conversion, meaning a period of study, immersion in mikvah, and milah, circumcision for men, which are the three traditional elements of conversion. In the 1920s, the CCR said those are not required and rabbis can do what they want. And that is still the operative resolution for the movement. And so there are plenty of Reform rabbis who don't require any or all of those rituals. And there are plenty of rabbis like me who require all of them for conversion, which again, that's a whole other conversation we could have. So that position, which is you can do what you want, is still pretty operable. The difference is the socialization around it, right? Which is, if you were a Reform rabbi who was openly not participating in same-sex marriage, openly not officiating, you would be very close to a pariah in most parts of the movement. Now, there are plenty of rabbis who don't care about those kind of things and are happy to do what they think is right on a variety of fronts. So there's the question of what's allowable, and then there's that previous the middle statement, which is we call upon the CCR to support all colleagues in their choices on this matter. That's where the heft of the consensus has really gone to the other side, which is the majority of the movement is beyond comfortable with this, but there are still some hangers on. Before we move forward to the most recent statement from 6 years ago, any other questions about this in 2000? What you're realizing is there are rules, but there are no rules, right? There is guidances that are offered, and the blessing and the challenge of being a Reform rabbi is, rather than having the guidance of the movement to say what I can and can't do, and what I have to and don't have to do, the difficulty of being a Reform rabbi is you actually have to come to your own conclusions and use your mind, which I think is beautiful. But it's a challenge for some. Jeff, you noted in earlier resolutions there wasn't a conversation around trans folk, and you're right. It's a newer piece of the conversation. Again, the same background, and I'm going to summarize here, which is basically saying, since the 1960s and 70s, the movement has tried to be near the leading edge of conversations around gays and lesbian folk, and now we are seeing the natural extension of that, right? And one thing we didn't do was look at the use of the word sex versus the word gender, but you saw a move from same-sex relationships to same-gender relationships, and the movement got more aware that sex and gender don't mean the same thing. And for those of you who were with us a few weeks ago with Rabbi Micah from Keshet, he talked a lot about the way, the differences between sex and gender and how they play out. And so then that's how we get to the LGBTQ, which is there's various axes around which these are moving. North American culture have in general become increasingly accepting of people who are gay, lesbian, and bisexual, yet too often transgender and gender non-conforming individuals are forced to live as second-class citizens, right? Even the idea of including both trans folk and gender non-conforming folk in this statement is something important, because trans still implies, essentially there are two genders. You're either male or you're female, and if you're trans, you went from being one to being the other. But the second clause, the gender non-conforming, suggests that there's a lot, not just something in between, there's a lot in between male and female, and then the entire spectrum is where we should have our attention. Efforts within the reform movement over the past decade reflect our commitment to inclusivity of gender and transgender non-conforming folk. In 2003, the Hebrew Union College Institute admitted its first openly transgender rabbinical student, which was Reuben Zellman, whose blessing for transgender folk we read this past Friday night as a blessing for Matt Sprinzen, but also for the entire trans community around us. Recently, in both NIFTY and URJ camps have taken steps to become more inclusive of transgender participants in their material, application forms, facilities, and programs. There are trans kids and trans teens at our camps who are given the opportunity to bunk with and participate with the gender of folks that they are most comfortable with, which is not going on around the world. Robin, go ahead.
So even to the point that I was at Camp Coleman, which is our local regional camp in Georgia, during staff training, Keshet did a workshop for all of the staff to help them to understand all of these things. And, for the camps, it has made a huge impact to think about what does it mean to have a transgender camper. And they have, Camp Coleman at least has made the decision that when they are aware that a transgender camper is coming to a bunk, that they ahead of time let the other people who are in that bunk know, so that they can be warm and welcoming and understanding.
I would say also that there's an increasing awareness in the movement, and certainly I think in working with teens, that a group of people who appear to all be of one gender should not presume to be all of one gender. That we shouldn't presume that because someone presents as male or presents as female, that they are cisgendered. And that awareness is, it's happening, and it's certainly, even for me, it takes a little bit of getting used to, right? When you see a group of people that you think are all teenage boys, should you address them as boys, or should you find other language to use around that? And I think there's an interesting conversation happening. And I'll just leave it at that. The last piece of this is in 2015, the CCR Placement Commission, right, which is the part of the CCR that works with the synagogues to help them hire rabbis, updated its policies to require that a congregation not discriminate based on gender identity. I shouldn't say that. That's not fair to the statement. Commit to including in their search all candidates, regardless of gender identity, right? Which is, and for those of you who are leaders of our congregation, some of you have probably sat on search committees, right? You can say you're not going to do certain things. You can say you're not going to be discriminatory, but at the end of the day, and this is something that gay and lesbian rabbis have dealt with. It's something that gender non-binary folk have dealt with. Women have dealt with this as well, which is that they say they're going to be open to everybody, but in the end, they end up picking the cis het white man in hiring, which is a concern that the movement is aware of and struggling with. Continuing. And then I got too many. Yeah, Jeff, go ahead.
The resistance that you talked about with some of the Southern congregations when the resolutions were passed in the 90s. Did we have any of this after 2015? Open resistance, opposed to what you were saying, where the resistance is quiet and agreed upon but not being practiced.
I didn't perceive that, Robin. Did you? No. There's, I think in every congregation, every congregation, including ours, has pockets where they know they're not going to like this. But I think that the consensus in the congregations is this is the right thing to do, and those regionalized differences do not. It's funny, Robin. As you're talking about Camp Coleman in Cleveland, Georgia, right, is one of those places where you would presume that would be. But we also know that the camps are in these far-flung places. The folks who go there aren't from Cleveland, Georgia. The folks who go there are from Miami and from Boca and Atlanta and other cities around the area. They're not from White County, which is the county that the camp is in, for those of you who haven't been to Camp Coleman. Therefore, be it resolved that the Union for Reform Judaism affirms its commitment to the full equality, inclusion, and acceptance of people of all gender identities and gender expressions, affirms the right of transgender and non-gender non-conforming individuals to be referred to by their name, gender, and pronoun preference in our congregations, camps, schools, and other Reform-affiliated organizations, encourages Reform congregations, congregants, clergy, camps, institutions, and affiliates, including NIFTY, to continue to advocate for the rights of people of all gender identities and expressions, and urges the adoption and implementation of legislation and policies that prevent discrimination based on gender identity and expression, and that require individuals to be treated equally under law as the gender by which they identify. This is why, for example, the RAC and the Reform movements are advocating for the Equality Act, because it's in keeping with the resolution that was passed by our movement, including to establish the right to change without undue burden their identification documents to reflect their gender and name, and ensuring equal access to medical and social services.
So I want everybody to understand that this is the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the rabbinic organization, calling on the URJ, which is the umbrella organization, to do things. So it works both ways. Some of these were the URJ or the UAHC saying to all of the members, this is what our resolution is. This is a case where the Central Conference of American Rabbis is going up the food chain. So it goes both ways.
I object to the up the food chain. It's a triangle. There's no food chain. The URJ is not at the top. They're partners.
Correct.
But you're right, Robin, that earlier you had the URJ calling on the CCAR to be more welcoming for same-sex marriage, and now you have it going the other way as well. So that's, yes. Calls upon the U.S. and Canadian governments, which is the governments in the purview of the CCAR, to change its laws to reflect this. Calls upon Reform movement institutions to work with local and national organizations to, I'm going to summarize, learn how to do this, right? Get those educational tools to educate the population as to why this is so important and what it means and how to do it. And some of the stuff that we were doing this month is an example of this. I like number 7, recommends URJ congregations and Reform institutions, facilities, and events to ensure, to the extent feasible, the availability of gender-neutral restrooms and other physical site needs that ensure dignity and safety for transgender and gender non-conforming individuals. When I came to Bethel, we had a family bathroom over by the sanctuary next to the men's room and the women's room, which I think was in keeping with the spirit of the statements. But when we did the renovation, now throughout the building, when there are bathrooms that are appropriate, they are labeled as all gender. So they can be used by a group, and they're big enough for a family to go into if you have, multiple people, but also it's a space where you can use that bathroom and not have to worry about who's going to see you using it and be made to feel uncomfortable. But we also have a position, which is that if you identify as a female, use the women's room, if that's what makes you comfortable, and vice versa as well. And finally, the last bit of the statement urges the institutions to review their use of language in prayers, forms, and policies to ensure people of all gender identities and gender expressions are welcomed, included, and accepted and respected, including statements of inclusion and non-discrimination, when it's feasible to use gender-neutral language, and offering more than 2 gender options or eliminating the need to select a gender on forms. I will share with the temple that our database partner in all this does not make this easy for us, because they come from a more traditional perspective, and they like being gendered, and we're working with them to try to find ways around that. It's a challenge. But there's also the simple thing, which is like when I have the form that I use myself when I'm meeting with the wedding couple, it doesn't need to say bride or groom. It can just say partner 1 and partner 2 on the forms and those kind of things. So we're working with that along the way. And to work with the institutions to create ritual, programmatic, and educational materials to empower us to do this. I will say, just as a word of summary, and then I'll let Robin have the last word, that we as a synagogue, we as a movement, I as a rabbi, feel like this is all a work in progress. And I'm enjoying the work, and there's a lot that we have accomplished, and we have a lot more to do. Robin?
And credit goes a great length to Greg, because we have had a number of false starts in creating the kinds of programs, the kinds of awareness that is happening right now at Temple Bethel, and we were not able to get it off the ground. But to have a rabbi who is willing to take this and make it something that is important has made a huge, huge difference in visibility. And I think that, what I said at the beginning, Temple Bethel has always been welcoming, but at this point, that's not enough. We need to take it to the next step. And that's what has been happening with this task force, and especially this month.
So with that, I think it's a perfect segue to talk about what's coming next week, which is next week we're going to have the leaders of our LGBTQ community, our task force, offer their own reflections on what it's been this month for us. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it was like to be at the various community events, to learn together in this way, what Pride Shabbat was like. And I also want to spend some time as a group brainstorming, where do we go from here? Because June ends in 8 days, but Pride doesn't end when the end of June. Or how do we, part of the thing that I'm thinking about is, how do we continue to make this a part of what we do every day of the week and every day of the year, not just during Pride Month in June. So thank you, Robin, and thank you to everybody, and we'll see you again next Tuesday.